seats. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Matthew Zabor. I'm a refugee law academic at the ANU College of Law, and on behalf of the Refugee Action Committee Canberra, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. Can I just say what a fabulous turnout this is? I think it once again reflects the commitment and the passion for these issues that we have here in the nation's capital, so congratulations for turning out today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Tonight's event is happening at a time of unparalleled threats to refugees globally. Populist political leaders around the globe are riding the revival of the nationalist xenophobia to scapegoat refugees, adopting rhetoric and policies that are far too familiar to us here in Australia. The fact that our two frontrunners for Prime Minister at the recent spill had both earned their political stripes by destroying the lives of refugees is a sad reflection of our times.
Shame. Shame.
As an activist community, we must not forget that it was our newly minted Prime Minister who oversaw the introduction of some of the most draconian, regressive refugee policies seen anywhere around the globe. This was complemented by taking the rhetoric of the inherent illegality, danger and criminality of the refugee to new levels. In terms of policy, although he inherited offshore processing from the Labour government, Scott Morrison showed callous disregard for the conditions in Manus Island and Nauru. In the face of overwhelming contrary evidence, he misled the public about the murder of Reza Barati and the death of Ahmed Karzai, blaming the refugees for their own precarious predicament. And he had saved the children's staff on Nauru forcibly deported after falsely accusing them of coaching refugee children to fabricate stories of self-harm and abuse. In Australia, meanwhile, he oversaw the wholesale stripping away of procedural rights for 30,000 refugee claimants in order deliberately to lower their rates of recognition as refugees. And as we found out earlier this year, he asked ASIO to delay security clearances for those entitled to permanent protection visas, delaying for such a long time that they could only be granted temporary visas and thereby denying them any chance to be reunited with their families. This has meant that some families will never be able to live together again. This is a deliberate, calculated, callous act of inhumanity, justified in the name of controlling our borders, and in utter disregard of the Minister's actual legal obligations in domestic and international law. He is, moreover, very well aware of the power of the image and of the word. One of his first acts in office was to deliver an instruction to his staff to use the term illegal whenever referring to boat arrivals. He changed the name of the department to emphasize border protection and militarized its work by turning it into an operational agency like Defence and the AFP. And of course, he ensured that he was flanked in his press conferences by Australian flags and high-ranking military brass to give the impression of a nation under attack from an unscrupulous, dangerous enemy. This is, after all, the former minister who had refugees sign assurances that they would not rape Australian women and children if they were released from mandatory detention, something not even criminals on remand need to do. And he had formed before coming to office. When in opposition, he urged Shadow Cabinet to capitalise on the electorate's growing concerns about Muslim immigration, Muslims in Australia, the inability of Muslims to integrate. Even Philip Ruttick felt such dog whistling went too far. In many respects, the current legal and political reality under which refugees in Australia, PNG and Nauru suffer and survive is a legacy of Scott Morrison, albeit standing on the shoulders of ministers going back, unfortunately, to Jerry Hand. As activists, it's important to remember this recent history and to remain informed, outraged, critical, and active in our condemnation. But also, as activists, we need to be constructive and positive if our arguments are going to prevail in the long term. We need to look to progressive policies adopted elsewhere, and in some cases, policies of the past, which with some tweaking and updating might serve as models for a humane program, when the time comes in the future. With bipartisan support for today's refugee policies, it's very easy for well-meaning friends and family members to assume that our current responses to refugee flows are somehow natural, logical, inevitable. Yes, it's terrible, but what else are we to do? Won't the boats come back? Won't people drown? And won't people just disappear into the community if we release them from detention? The absence in our political discourse of a coherent, pragmatic alternative to a policy of deterrence has created something of an imagination vacuum, which we as activists need to challenge. Yet, as both of our speakers tonight will discuss, we're not short of alternative models that meet national economic and policy objectives as well as protecting fundamental rights. It's crucial for us not just to become better informed about the human costs of Operation Sovereign Borders, mandatory detention, but we also need to learn about the creation of safe migration pathways, cost-effective alternatives to detention, and regional options for identifying, protecting, and resettling refugees. And that is the purpose of tonight's talk, alternatives to cruelty. With that in mind, let me introduce our two speakers. Dr. Clare Higgins is a Senior Research Associate at the Caldwell Center for International Refugee Law at UNSW, and is currently, or has just finished, a Fulbright postdoctoral scholarship at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. She's also the author of this book, Asylum by Boat, Origins of Australia's Refugee Policy, which was published just last year to critical acclaim. And for those of you who want to buy copies of the book, it will be available in the foyer at the end of tonight's lecture. Clare will be discussing her research on the policies of the 1970s and 1980s to deal with Sino-Vietnamese refugees in the region. Should be followed by Dr. John Mims. John needs very little introduction to a Canberra-RAC audience. He's an associate professor of politics and international relations here at ANU, an award-winning lecturer, and one of the leading lights of the Refugee Action Committee. At this meeting, John will discuss the possibility of adopting a decent and humanitarian policy in Australia today and what that policy might look like. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Clare Higgins.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to John and to RAC for organising this, and Matthew for that very powerful introduction. So, Matthew said that I'm a Senior Research Associate at Caldwell Center for International Refugee Law at UNSW, but I'm an historian, and I wanted to share some of my research on Australia's refugee policy history with you tonight that speaks to our theme of alternative policy approaches. And I'll segue from talking about that research to talking about my more recent project, which I was undertaking at Georgetown and elsewhere.
Can you speak up, please?
Sure. On humanitarian visas. Is that better?
No.
It doesn't go any closer. This does just sound like having to stoop a little bit.
I'll stoop and project. Do tell me if that isn't loud enough. So I'll talk a little bit about the research for the book that speaks to our theme, but then I'll segue at the end on some discussion of alternative policies that are in place right now, some contemporary examples that I've just finished researching in Italy and the US. So to the first topic, I wrote this book about an earlier era in Australian refugee history when just over 2,000 people arrived by boat, and they were brought ashore and granted protection under the then Fraser government. And as already said, we're here tonight to discuss alternative policies. And one of the fascinating things, among many, of this particular period is that there was no formal refugee policy to begin with. There was no formal means of responding to asylum seekers. Before the Vietnamese arrived, we don't have any statistics on how many people came to Australia to claim asylum. The Department of Immigration didn't keep comprehensive information about who they were, where they were from, and what happened to them. And so this meant that when the first Vietnamese sailed into Darwin Harbour in April 1976. They were 5 young men who had made that journey over several weeks. There was no status determination procedure through which their claims for protection could be assessed. And in researching this history, I accessed a number of archival collections, one of which was created by UNHCR staff, the High Commissioner for Refugees staff in Australia at that time. And those records showed me the working relationship between the Australian government and UNHCR. And together, the Department of Immigration and other departments liaised and consulted with UNHCR to set up that procedure for assessing asylum seekers' claims. UNHCR staff travelled up to Darwin to observe how boat arrivals were brought ashore, how they were treated. And the assessment was that Australian authorities were treating asylum seekers arriving by boat with, quote, a high degree of compassion. Anyone who needed it received specialist medical help within hours. Asylum seekers were placed in quarantine for a few days. They were able to cook their own meals with fresh ingredients. They were able to go fishing off the side of the quarantine station. And then they were transferred to accommodation in capital cities and communities around Australia. So that was the evidence from the UNHCR archives. Then we have another story about policy options from departmental files that I found in the National Archives here in Canberra. And these files showed me that as asylum seekers were being brought ashore with, as UNHCR reported, a high degree of compassion, other policy options were being considered, ones that we are now sadly familiar with. I found lists of options of ways in which Vietnamese asylum seekers could be discouraged from attempting to sail to Australia. And these options were put together by immigration, sometimes in consultation with other departments. One list I found quite late in the research process, and what I read on it physically took my breath away. Among the 9 options it set out for discouraging boat arrivals, I'll read you 2. Treat boat refugees almost as lepers, segregating them into special camps and giving them minimal standards of support. And the next one. Construct a major holding centre in some very remote area to a standard of construction, maintenance and supportive care in no way different to the environment the boat people left in Thailand or Malaysia. Hold them in such a camp indefinitely and bring them into regular hostels as circumstances permit. Now, in retirement, former Prime Minister Fraser told an interviewer that less palatable policy options were to be found in the papers of the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs. And that list tells us that he was right. I included it in the book, and I'm telling you about it here tonight, not to sensationalise it, but to consider that decision-making process. As I have found on this issue and on other policy areas at that time, the style of decision-making was to present all the options on the table, if only to knock them down. And I found again and again that these kind of options that I've just mentioned, segregating refugees into camps, holding them indefinitely, were knocked down. And they were knocked down for the reasons that they failed today. They were deemed to be completely unfeasible for a whole number of reasons. The then Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs, Mr. Lou Engelbau, described these harsh options. It's written at the top of the list, these are a challenge to our humanity. Most importantly, from an historian's perspective, the Secretary committed further thoughts on these harsh options to paper. And his assessments were realistic and perceptive. He rejected the idea of turning back boats due to one unanswered question. Turn back to where? And that remains unanswered today. He rejected the idea of detaining asylum seekers for 4 reasons that still stand today. He wrote that, firstly, detention would create a political problem, and and it has. Studies have shown that since mandatory detention was introduced, it may have actually compounded adverse public opinion on asylum seekers because it has distanced and therefore in some way dehumanised their plight from the community. Secondly, the Secretary wrote that detention will not deter votes, and we know that it hasn't in the last 25 years since mandatory detention was introduced. Thirdly, the Secretary wrote that detention was not a final answer to the issue of forced migration, and it isn't, as we all know. The 1,500 or so people who are on Manus and Nauru right now still need durable solutions, and Australia's current approach to asylum seeking does not provide or address the protection needs of asylum seekers in our region. And finally, the Secretary wrote that detention would require, quote, a tremendous guard apparatus. Now you can imagine he wasn't necessarily able to conceive of the system that we have now. As we know, that guard apparatus has grown into a militarised border control system that costs $7 billion. So it's disheartening, to say the least, that the failures of the approach today were foreseen. But while people were being received, brought ashore with compassion, and while these policy approaches were being debated behind the scenes, in public, the language used by the then Minister and by the Department was focused on diffusing the issue of boat arrivals, of reassuring the public that government was in control of the issue, and that those who were sailing to Australia were people just like us. For example, during the 1977 election campaign, 7 boats arrived in 1 week, 10 days out from the poll, and the Minister released a statement to say, quote, the boat people had undergone intensive interviews which had confirmed stories of hardship and courage. Australia, he said, in accepting these people, is honouring its international obligations to provide sanctuary to refugees. And so within that statement, we have an emphasis on control of entry. Control being, as Professor James Jupp of ANU has written, a pillar of Australia's approach to immigration since Federation. But it was a very different emphasis than we have now. It was an emphasis on a fair, principled and efficient status determination procedure. As he said, the boat people have undergone intensive interviews that have confirmed stories of hardship and courage. So then we have the question of well, how did that impact public opinion? And unfortunately, very few opinion polls on this issue were conducted then. So we don't have too much to go with. But in my interview with former Prime Minister Fraser, he told me that his government didn't conduct any polling on the refugee issue because on whether or not Australia should accept asylum seekers, because in his reasoning, people would have said no. Now, I don't know how to check whether or not they did or didn't conduct polling, but all the evidence that I found, the press releases, the Minister's speeches, the notes behind the scenes, show a very clear effort to positively frame the acceptance of refugees and asylum seekers and to emphasise that status determination system as a means of controlling entry. Now, former Prime Minister Fraser thought the public would say no, and perhaps he was right at that time. But in recent years, qualitative surveys have shown that Australians are very proud of the nation's history in accepting Vietnamese refugees. In hindsight, Australians say yes. Today, Australians are not being given the opportunity to say yes or to understand that a fair, principled, rigorous status determination procedure is a means of responding to asylum seeker arrivals alongside an expanded resettlement program and a range of resettlement pathways. And that brings me to my next and ongoing research project, which concerns humanitarian visas, or what are known as protected entry procedures. As Matthew said, I've just finished up in the US looking at the use of these visas, and I was able to do some field work elsewhere. So if I can explain the point of these visas is when we think of how a person might access protection, under international law, we often think of that individual undertaking a potentially dangerous journey, making their own way to a particular territory to claim asylum. Or we might think of that person accessing a more limited, formalised pathway, that is, of resettlement, where they're found, identified as a refugee abroad, and then referred and selected for resettlement under one of the annual resettlement programs that around 39 countries run every year, including Australia. Unfortunately, less than 1% of refugees, it's estimated, would have access to that program. These two pathways underpin a dichotomy, an idea of orderly or authorised entry for refugees as opposed to a disorderly and irregular movement of asylum seekers. And that dichotomy, as you know, is influential in public and political discourse, and it ignores the fact that it is legal to seek asylum, and that the drafters of the Refugee Convention recognised that a person may not have travel rights and may have to cross international borders without authorisation. So the humanitarian visas that I'm researching right now fall in between those pathways. They're visas that states provide through which asylum seekers can journey safely to that territory to then lodge their application to claim asylum. It's essentially asking the question of why can't asylum seekers, why can't refugees fly to safety, which is a question that Professor Alex Betts posed to the New York Times in 2015 at the height of the Syrian exodus into Europe. So I'll give you one example that you might have read about in the news. It's a scheme in place in Italy. It's called the Humanitarian Corridors, and it's designed for asylum seekers who are in countries of first asylum or transit, and it allows them to board a plane, fly into Rome, and then lodge their papers on arrival. And the program began in late 2015, and through to the end of last year, 2017, 1,000, mostly Syrians, have been safely flown from Beirut to Rome's Fiumicino airport. Now, I know that 1,000 is not very many, but that 2-year period was the pilot program, and it was deemed successful. The program was renewed for this year. More places were granted. France has launched its own version of the humanitarian corridors. Belgium has launched a small version as well. And the Italian corridors have been expanded to bring the Eritreans out of Ethiopia. So the program, the humanitarian corridors, have received quite a bit of media attention because they offer that counter-narrative to a restrictive approach to forced migration. They are an ecumenical initiative. They were established by the Italian church communities, faith-based organisations. And those organisations take on considerable practical responsibility in making this humanitarian visa scheme work. Their staff travel to Lebanon, in the case of the Lebanese humanitarian corridors, for 3 months at a time. They liaise with local NGOs and, where relevant, UNHCR to access potential applicants. They interview these applicants several times, and then the security checks are undertaken by Italian authorities, and the visas are issued by Italian authorities. And then the faith-based organisations fund the asylum seekers to fly into Italy about every 6 weeks, and they submit their applications on arrival. And all their travel and reception costs for the first 6 months at least, while their applications for protection are being processed, are funded and managed and supported by those faith-based organisations and their community networks throughout Italy. And that includes accommodation and language courses and job training. So the reason I mentioned this kind of program is because Australia has a visa that operates in a similar manner. It's the subclass 201 visa, a special humanitarian visa. And from the figures that are available from the department's annual report, the most recent annual report, around 200 and something people were brought into Australia on this visa last year, but more than 2,000 people applied. We don't know much about how it operates, or where these people come from, or why there's such a low recognition or acceptance rate. The Australian Human Rights Commission has recommended in its Pathways to Protection report in 2016 that the subclass 201 visa be expanded, that asylum seekers have greater access to Australia through formal orderly channels. And other reports on policy alternatives in Australia in recent years have made a similar recommendation. So I'll finish on that note, and hopefully at some point I can update you in the future on how this research progresses, and hopefully we will see a greater use of these kind of pathways in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. It seems to me that the contrast between what we've just heard about in the 1970s and the 1980s and what we're seeing today is so great that we have to gasp, actually, at how far this country has come, both in terms of its policy, its public policy, but also in terms of its political discourse and the way in which we talk about refugees and asylum seekers and so on. The fundamentals of the policy today I'm not going to go through in great detail, because I think many of you know about those details, and you know about the cruelty and the lack of humanity and the lack of generosity that's involved in all of them. But I want to say that the fundamental thing on which this policy is based today is deterrence. Now, the thing about deterrence is that by its very nature, you have to create a situation for people that if they take a course of action that you don't want them to take, that is to come to the country by boat, that you have to make the outcome for them worse if they undertake that course of action than if they didn't. That's the first thing. You can't have a policy of deterrence, it seems to me, which is humane and generous. Because to be humane and generous would not deter people. That's the first and fundamental problem, I think, with deterrence. The second problem, I think, with deterrence is that if at first you don't succeed, you've got to try harder. That if your first program for deterrence is, for example, mandatory detention, and as Claire said, it didn't successfully deter people or deter enough people for, as far as the government felt, then what you've got to do is to increase the level of suffering that you subject people to if they take that course of action. And Manus Island and Nauru are a next step up on that, and the permanent refusal to accept people, whatever the justice of their claims, if they come by boat. 5 years ago now, last July the 19th, with the announcement by Kevin Rudd that those people would never come to Australia, is an example of the ramping up of the levels of deterrence in order to achieve that aim. But also, I think, in order to achieve political aims, because this is not just anymore a cold policy issue where bureaucrats or technocrats sit down and work out the best course of action to take, as perhaps it was the case with the bureaucrats that Claire discussed in the 1970s. This is now a political issue where the political superstructure of society has now an interest in finding it out, whatever the facts on the ground. Each side of politics has an interest, a political interest, in defending a position of harshness, of cruelty and inhumanity, independent of the independent facts on the ground. And as a result of that, increasing levels of deterrence and cruelty, what we've seen, very briefly, is what you would expect to see. And that is, we've seen great harm. The IHMS report, which is not always sympathetic, by the way, to asylum seekers and refugees, done back in May 2014, found that 13% of those arriving at that time already had extremely severe depression because of their background, because of the things that they'd come from. That grows to 22% in detention between 4 and 6 months, and 44% for those detained more than 19 months. The people on Manus and Nauru have now mostly been there for 5 years. So you can imagine the level of harm. The Forgotten Children report, of course, shows hundreds of instances of children engaging in self-harm. And that was back in 2014, a long time ago. 109 of those children on Nauru are still there. And the Nauru files, so 2,000 leaked staff reports. These aren't reports by the asylum seekers and refugees, but by the staff, of the terrible things that were happening, of self-harm, of depressive episodes, of all sorts of terrible things happening in Nauru. And just, I think yesterday, a new report released by the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre and the Refugee Council that shows that the situation on Nauru in particular had degenerated even much further than that. And they said that people had actually been broken by the experience. So this is the ramping up of levels of deterrence. And it's built in to a policy of attempting to deter people. And of course, as a result of that, practically every organisation in the world that deals with refugees has condemned Australia's policy. I won't go through the details, but the UNHCR, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the UN Human Rights Council, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Australian Churches Refugee Task Force, the Australian Catholic Bishops Conference, and so on, and many, many other organisations as well. And what we used to do is very different. We used to, in that period, roughly 1977 to 83, there was something like 100,000 refugee visas issued, not all to Indo-Chinese, but a significant number for a population that was then not much more than half this population today. And over the longer period, resettled Indo-Chinese refugees, about 185,000 up to 1997. And in that period, around about 2,000 people only came by boat, and roughly 60 boats. The reason for that is that Australia at the time did have imperfect, but nevertheless real alternative corridors and pathways for people to come in a safe way. So the vast majority of Indo-Chinese refugees in that period were flown to Australia. They were coming from places like Malaysia, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on. And their applications had been taken there and assessed there. And the camps themselves were largely horrible. But nevertheless, they were then able to be taken largely safely to a place of refuge. And there was no mandatory detention, no offshore detention, and no permanent exclusion, of course, for those who came by boat. So there are alternatives, and we can see some of those alternatives in our own past. We don't have to adopt the entire policy of the past, but it was an orderly program, by and large. It didn't open the borders, and our campaigners never suggested simply opening the borders and allow anyone who wants to come, but setting up orderly pathways for resettlement, or at least even through to be able to come and present your claim, as Claire's suggestion in her new research, to come safely is one possibility. But to do that, there are a couple of things, of course, a number of things that we've got to stop doing. So the negative parts of a real alternative is firstly to end these things. End the whole policy of deterrence, which involves mandatory detention, offshore detention, Manus and Nauru, and boat turn-backs. Secondly, there will be some people from time to time who will take to boats, and they will come. That will not stop because the refugee crisis in many parts of the world will not stop. We've now got, I think, 68.5 million displaced people in the world, a record since World War II, at least. And some of those people will get on boats to go across the Mediterranean or to come from Indonesia to Australia. And we have to then treat those people as asylum seekers, not as illegal migrants, not as people who have broken any law. But key thing, firstly, is that we significantly increase the number of refugees that we actually resettle. As I say, 68.5 million displaced people in 2017. That's increasing at the rate of about 45,000 people per day. These are people displaced per day, 2002 to 2017. So the need is very great. And the vast majority of these people don't come to places like Australia. Most of those people go to places adjacent to the situations of crisis that they find themselves in. So Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, Lebanon, Iran, and so on, before you get to a developed country such as Germany. In fact, developing regions host 85% of the world's refugees. A rule of thumb is almost that the less the capacity that you have to look after refugees, the more likely you have them to look after. And the least developed countries in the world host 1/3 of the world's refugees. And we're way, way back. In terms of the actual resettlement program that we have, once refugees are assessed as refugees and accepted as refugees in Australia, and certainly it's quite successful, but it's still tiny by comparison, both with other countries which are hosting refugees and with our own capacity. So I did a graph here, because the suggestion is that perhaps the number of refugees who are coming is much too high. That's the Australian population. Actually, the graph is a bit old. It was announced since I did this that it's now 25 million. And that's the refugees currently accepted per year, which is 13,750. I didn't forget to fill out the figures. But what if we tripled the number of refugees that we take and take it up to 40,000? That's the way the graph would look. Again, it would be barely noticeable. But that's a graph. Let's think about how it would look to us in the place where we live. If we tripled our refugee intake to 40,000, and I think that's a realistic number that we could easily handle, the Australian National University has 22,000 students at the moment. If the 40,000 people we took are spread across the Australian population evenly, that would mean ANU would get an extra 37.8 students. I think we're heading towards that in tutorial size. At Bruce Stadium, assuming that the refugees we accept are to the degree that the rest of the population is Raiders supporters or Brumbies supporters, and it's a full stadium, at full capacity, tripling the refugee intake would mean an extra 40.8 people. And I'll guarantee you just about every queue is larger than that at the stadium. So the effect would be small. Compared to immigration, net immigration last year was 245,000. That's the graph of net migration compared to the refugee intake per year. Again, very, very small part of it. The key question, it seems to me, is the question again that Claire raised, which is to provide an alternative pathway, a safe pathway, where people don't feel the need to get on boats. And that means fair, not accelerated, but fair and rapid processing in the countries of transit, followed by safe passage to Australia. And it's the countries of transit, the countries sometimes of first asylum, sometimes of second asylum even, that are critical here. Because if we could do that processing in conjunction with the UNHCR in those countries, then this would be the situation rather than people drowning at sea. Wouldn't it be great to have a Prime Minister who turned up at the airport to welcome refugees? The transit countries are one of the key questions here, because what has happened in the last period is that the transit countries have become a bottleneck for asylum seekers. No one is a refugee in their own country. To claim refugee status, you must have left. First of all, you must have left and gone to another country. And that, of course, will almost always be a country, a relatively poor country, a country with relatively small capacity to accept and absorb refugees. And so, by and large, you need to move on. And that has become very difficult in the transit countries, and in particular in the transit countries country that's most important to us in our region, recent past, which is Indonesia. It was reported in 2014 that to get an interview, and this is the first interview, this is not an assessment, but to get an interview with the UNHCR in Jakarta was taking between 7 and 11 months, and longer in Malaysia. And in Indonesia, for example, the asylum seekers, while they're waiting there, do not have work rights. Some of their children may have education rights if they've been assessed by the UNHCR as refugees, and they have to understand Bahasa Indonesian, they may get education rights, but the vast majority don't have education rights for their children. And that has become worse over time. So, and it's partly the doing in Australia, because between 2001 and 2010, we were processing refugees from Indonesia, but the rate was only 560 over those 9 or 10 years. It's a tiny number of people. So a bottleneck of people who got to Indonesia as a transit country, a place they could live in relative safety, couldn't get out, and then couldn't go further on in a passageway for asylum. But in November 2014, Scott Morrison announced that anyone registering with the UNHCR in Indonesia after the previous June, so retrospective as well, would be ineligible for resettlement in Australia anyway. So it was not just a trickle coming anymore, it was an absolute barrier, a blockade to anyone who'd gone to Indonesia ever coming here. By August 2015, the waiting period for an interview in Indonesia with the UNHCR is 20 months, and resettlement, if it happens, takes less than 2 years. In 2016, the UNHCR advised people there not to expect resettlement in under 6 years, and in October last year, the UNHCR admitted that most refugees in Indonesia will never be resettled. So it's the classic case of people having found a place of relative safety as a country of first or second asylum, as a transit country, now being locked in there and unable to move on and start their lives. So what alternatives are left for refugees in transit countries? Very few. You can go through and read many, many accounts of people who've actually got on dangerous boat journeys. And you think, why would they do that? And they all say essentially the same thing. They all say that there was nothing else they could do. They could go back home, but as this young man here, who wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2010, who got on a boat to come to Australia, said, going back to Afghanistan, he says, would be a death sentence. And he knew, he says, he knew that the journey by boat was dangerous. It was a last resort, and that we could lose our lives. But they took the chance anyway because of the lack of an alternative. And they took the chance, and those who've lost their lives in taking that chance have lost their lives because countries like Australia haven't provided them with the alternative. And the same, I think, there's elements of this in the European situation as well, where we find the Syrian civil war begins in 2011. The number of refugees accepted from particularly Turkey, but also from Jordan and Lebanon, Syrian refugees into Europe is tiny, quite tiny. And eventually in 2015, after 4 years for many people living in the camps there, they get on boats. Not suddenly, but there are a large number of them who then start to get on boats. Another element of an alternative refugee policy, a couple of elements already, get rid of the things that I mentioned before, considerably increase the number of refugees that we take, provide safe pathways by doing the processing in the transit countries and flying people to safety when they're successful in their applications. But also we should be redirecting the vast amount of money that we're spending on detention towards making the lives of people, of refugees, here, but also in the transit countries, more bearable. So what do we spend it on? The Australian detention system, 2 studies looked at the cost between 2013 and 2016 and reckoned that it was 3.2 billion, roughly, per year. That's everything. That's the increased aid to PNG, aid in inverted commas, to PNG and Nauru and so on. The Treasury supplied figures in January this year to Senate estimates that suggested that in the financial year 2016 to 17 it's actually gone up to 4.06 billion. Depends on how you calculate it, but it's a very large amount of money. The UNHCR budget, by the way, in 2017 was $7.7 billion, significantly underfunded. And that's one of the reasons that the rate of processing of applications for asylum is so slow in places like Indonesia, and the quality of people's lives in those transit countries is so poor. Our $4 or so billion is to detain, lock up approximately 30,000 people, including those on bridging visas in Australia, and to stop any others coming. The UNHCR budget, which is less than half the Australian budget for the world, is to look after 19.9 million refugees under their mandate. We could redirect a large amount of that money very, very easily towards much more useful goals than locking people up and paying small Pacific Islands to do it for us. Just to put that in some sort of perspective, the average prisoner in an Australian jail costs the taxpayer about $106,000 a year, according to Productivity Commission. Manus Island and Nauru was costing about $400,000 per year, and detention in Australia was costing about $239,000 per year per person. The costs of an asylum seeker living in the community on a bridging visa while their claim is processed, you get various figures for this, but around $10,000, maybe $13,000, I've seen different figures, according to the averages given by the Department of Home Affairs in May this year. A vast amount of money is being spent on cruelty rather than helping people out. 6, on the basis of changing these policies, we could then push for an international system of coordinated refugee protection, where other countries take larger numbers of refugees. But we can't do it now. We're in no position to do it now. We'd be laughed out of any international forum if we suggested that now. But actually, in the period of the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, there was such an arrangement. There were actually 2 different schemes operating through the 70s and the 1980s for sharing the number of refugees who were taken. The US, China, Canada, Australia, and so on, and France all took very significant numbers on the basis of that agreement. There's no reason why developed countries now can't do the same thing for the current large number of refugees, but in fact the opposite is happening. The United States basically cut its refugee quota in half last year under Trump. So, the message is there are alternatives. When the politicians tell us that either you'll have an open border and the whole world will come here and overwhelm us, or you'll have thousands of people dying at sea, we should not believe them. There are alternatives that are simple, that are relatively easy to implement now in terms of redirecting spending, especially in terms of then making international agreements. These things can be done, they should be done, they must be done, but we'll have to fight to make sure that they are done.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Claire. Well, we've got about half an hour, is that right? About 20 minutes or so of Q&A, so I'll share with you questions from the audience for our panelists. Right, up at the back.
Politicization of this issue. It's classic wedge politics. We've been sucked into political behaviour, and it's about time that there was some courage shown, and I put that to the media as well. The ABC is finally starting to say something, but it's been a hell of a long while. You know, they're even talking about climate change, thank God. So, you know, this is really what's going on. It's classic wedge politics, and everyone's been sucked into it. And the lowest common denominator is driving this. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Right, I think it's an important point. How do we address the politicisation of the problem? We've known, for instance, about the economic impost of mandatory detention for a long time. Departmental officials have said for at least the last 10 years that mandatory detention doesn't work as a deterrence policy, and yet we we still accept these as it would be political suicide to ditch them. So how do we address politicisation, I suppose, is
I think you're absolutely right. It is being politicised. When you look at all of the changes that have ramped up the level of deterrence, they've been, some of them, suspiciously close to elections where the ruling party looked like losing. 1992, where they looked like losing the Labor Party looked like losing the 93 election until they got the gift of John Howard and the GST. 2001, where the polls were showing that Howard was going to lose the election later that year after the Tampa. And 2013, certainly when Rudd was there to save the furniture, when he made the final announcement in this host of policy announcements. So yeah, I think there is a politicisation, there's no question about it. On the other hand, there has been, despite the fact that there is a bipartisan policy about this, and it's been a bipartisan policy for a long time, and as you rightly say, most of the press has played a pretty bad role in it. Despite that, the thing that I find amazing is that there's still a very large chunk of the Australian population that don't like it. The worst of the polls that I've seen for what we're arguing, and that'll be about vote turnbacks probably, the worst of the polls that I've seen recently show that we still have 25 to 27% of the population. Now, the more recent polls, if you ask people whether people should be brought from Nauru and Manus to Australia, it's a majority of people say that. The problem is that we've got a majority, but that doesn't translate into political action. I mean, you mentioned climate change. There's a majority of Australians who think a lot more should be done about climate change. It's not happening. What we've got to do is to turn our support base, we've got to turn that majority about Manus and Nauru, or turn even the minorities and other questions, we've got to turn them into action. It means people not just thinking that it's a good idea for Manus and Nauru, but people getting out and doing something that Manus and Nauru asylum seekers, refugees should be brought here, but people are getting out and doing something about it. All campaigns that fight for high stakes, you know, because we've set the bar pretty high here in what we're trying to do, take time to achieve. And this seems like a very long time, I know. They take time to achieve, but eventually there is no other way except people like us getting together and saying, how can we influence our neighbours, our workmates, our families, and then how can we put pressure on the politicians?
What I thought was quite interesting coming out of Clare's talk was that there was a time in Australian history when our traditional obsession with control over the borders was actually used to leverage a positive response to refugees. We always think of it as, you know, we will decide who comes and the circumstances in which we come. That means we close the door. Well, we can decide who comes, and in doing so, up our resettlement quota, have a thorough refugee status determination regime for those who do arrive. That is also control. It seems that we have a historical precedent for it coming out of your important research. Other questions? We have one here.
Yes. What do we say to somebody who argues that deterrence has worked, that votes have stopped? What's the one you hear?
Reports of votes have stopped.
Have votes stopped? There's an assumption in the question.
As Matthew just said, and an audience member just said, reports of them of votes have stopped, apart from, as we saw last week, and on a handful of occasions since 2014. But we don't know, really, given the lack of transparency on this policy area, on what goes on out at sea. We don't actually know what's happening. We don't know if people are being intercepted and turned back. So it's very hard for us to accurately say how much our current policy has impacted on the attempts by asylum seekers to reach Australia by boat.
Could I say something? Yeah, that's
A couple of other points, just to add to it. I would say to the person who said, well, let's stop the boats. First of all, I'd say, is the objective to stop the boats, or is the objective to help the people who are in desperate situations? That's the first thing. You know? There are ways of providing alternatives to people not to get on boats in the first place. But the objective in that is to help the people who are in these desperate circumstances. So that's the first thing. Two separate questions. And the stop the boats question has become this national obsession. Last week, you might remember a Vietnamese fishing boat ended up in Queensland in the Daintree with, what was it, 17 people?
Yeah.
17 people on it. And it was a major issue. I got called in to do TV interviews about it, you know, because it was such a big question. Suddenly everyone's talking about it. Dutton blames the Labor Party for the vote arriving because they've been talking up the possibility of limits on detention and madness and so on. The people smugglers have got a message, and so they sent this. This is a sign of seriously distorted politics, the obsession with a vote. So that would be the second thing I'd say to your person.
Yes, up at the back. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to ask about what we can do to help the refugees on Manus Island and Nauru, because I think seeing them as an important player in the struggle for justice for refugees is really important. Behrooz Bachani, who everyone should hopefully know, an absolute freedom fighter, absolute hero, who's a refugee that's in prison on Manus Island at the moment. I was at the Socialism Conference in Sydney recently where he phoned in to a panel there. One of the things that he said was, well, he's in prison and over here in Australia, we're not in prison. As long as he's locked up, no one's free. And I think that actually helps explain why things are getting more cruel and why our fight's so important is that, yeah, every election when a government's unpopular, well, they found the perfect scapegoat. They now have a few thousand of them locked up, setting themselves on fire at Manus Island and Nauru. The other thing Behrooz Bachani said was that, he gets asked, does he have enough food? What's his clothes like? Are they giving him enough attention? He said none of that's that important. What makes him be able to hold on to his humanity, what makes him be able to actually hold it together to get through the tough time that he's on, is his ability to protest and to fight back and to write and to let everyone know. So I was just wondering, and I think that's really powerful. So I was just wondering what we can do to sort of help their fight for justice, and how we can sort of see what we do here as part of that as well.
Thank you. Well, before I hand over to the speakers to respond to that, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. We have to hear the voices of the refugees and ensure that they are empowered in this process. And there's no better person to be the voice of and for refugees than Behrooz. Behrooz Bachani's book, No Friend But the Mountains, is being launched at our next major event. Behrooz will be Skyping in on the 27th of September. So I do encourage people to come here and to hear from Behrooz himself. John, do you want to talk anything about how we can better support community?
Actually, one of the people involved in the campaign here, who's a Hazara refugee, is very active in Iraq. Zaki, many of you might know. He spoke at our last meeting and he said that he's been in detention and he thought one of the real things that kept him going was knowing that there were lots of people out of detention here who were campaigning to get him out and were campaigning to put an end to the whole system. So that I think is something that we can do. But the building of a campaign is multifaceted. I think there are a few things that are fundamental to the kind of campaign that we've built in Canberra and in other places in Australia. One is that it's very broad and diverse. You know, you're going to have bishops and building workers on the same march. At times, you're going to have young students and retirees and all sorts of people. And we've very, very carefully done that to draw in people from many different backgrounds. The second thing is that there's no, this is a negative thing, I suppose, there's no silver bullet. I was talking to Julian Burnside a little while back when he was in Canberra, and someone asked him, what can you do to change the policy? He said, well, if I knew, I would have done it. You know, there's no single thing that you can do. All you can do is the slow, perhaps sometimes not so slow, process of building a campaign. It's got to be built brick by brick. Last Palm Sunday, I think there were 35 or 40 churches in Canberra that hung up banners outside their churches advertising the march. Let's go for 50. You know, there were a whole heap of unions that sent contingents. That's double the number. Those are the sorts of things that are on the ground ways of building a campaign. And most importantly, you might not think of yourself as an activist or of doing these sorts of things, but there's a place in the campaign for everyone. For everyone, whatever your time and whatever talent you've got, there's a place for you.
Matthew, can I comment on that question?
Yes, please do.
Is there anyone else here from the Manners Lives Matter group?
On the where, sorry?
The Manners Lives Matter group. Glenn, would you like to speak because you're more involved than I? If you want to provide practical help to the guys on Manners, there are two organisations, small grassroots organisations in Canberra that you can work with. Glenn here is more involved than I am, so he will speak.
We work with Sydney Joe, we have been giving around 50 mobile phone top-ups per month to the guys from us, and that's highly important. It's about mental health. They can ring home, they can talk to their loved ones. My wife and I talk to about 5 of them, almost all the time. It's just that sort of practical stuff. We've got a bank account if people want to contribute. We've got an auditable process that you know it's not going to be wasted. John, any other things you can?
There's another project that's getting off the ground too with an organisation called Act for Peace. That's a church-based organisation, ecumenical, working with the Refugee Council of Australia to provide additional support to the men while they're on this. And you can see the articles.
Sorry, I also, yeah, that's true. We've got a lady that's over there at the moment that is helping keep people safe. She physically goes when there's an attempted suicide or before if possible and works because there's nobody there to help them medically. So they have to go to White Whittle and nobody wants to take the responsibility for anything. So you probably saw a photo a few weeks ago of the guy who's bleeding about 3 times as much as should be. It took nearly a month to get him off that island. It was only because activists were continually taking it to the government and promoting it, that eventually that person got off and then asylum. So yeah, he probably would have been dead, but he was lucky enough to survive.
Is there a website or something?
So two organisations being Act for Peace, which I think are affiliated with the Refugee Council of Australia. I think there's links from the Refugee Council.
And there are links from our website.
And there are links from the RAC website as well as for...
Perhaps I could suggest
Yeah.
that if you have questions about it, send your query to the RAC website and they will forward it on to the appropriate people and get back to you very quickly.
Thanks. And I think it's very important that the evidence, and I'm sure it's anecdotal, but I'm sure it's also been shown empirically that those who are in detention, those who are in asylum in Nauru, the sustenance they get from knowing that there are people in Australia who care about their plight and who are still arguing for their rights it's very important. So we have another question at the back there.
Don't want to take away from any of what you're saying, but first question relates to the transit camps. There was a brief moment, when the Australian government tried to, if you like, treat the who's looking after them? Who's paying for the upkeep? Is any Australians involved? Are there any voluntary organisations working in there? These seem to be forgotten people.
So the transit camps in Indonesia, in particular, probably also in the region more generally. I'm not quite certain.
I don't. This isn't an area that I know much about, but I can certainly put you in touch. Can we chat afterwards? I can put you in touch with someone who does this exact research.
I think you're right. The Australians were involved for a while, but a lot of Australian policy has also been trying to prevent people getting to Indonesia in the first place as well. So there's Australian efforts in South Asia and Pakistan, etc., to stop people using people smugglers to get to Indonesia. The situation in the camps, my understanding, is pretty dire. There's various obligations that you have once you've signed up with UNHCR, and you rights that you only get if you're in the camps, but the camps are so dire that people are out of the camps, therefore not able to access the rights. It's a pretty dire situation. But all of a sudden we had a sea of hands. Okay, that's here.
Excuse my ignorance on this, but it seems to me that the Papua New Guinea High Court have no difficulty in ruling the unconstitutionality of the actions by, in terms of manners. I'm intrigued as to why the High Court of Australia could not rule in terms of unconstitutionality, in terms of breaching the UN Convention. Probably my complete ignorance of this, but could someone explain that to me?
I'll do that as the lawyer. The simple answer to that is we have no Bill of Rights, and they do. So they have a provision in the Papua New Guinea Constitution that prohibits arbitrary detention. There was an attempt to get around it when the Asylum Detention Centre was set up, and their courts there found a way of gazumping that under the Constitution. We have no such similar provision here. There's been an attempt to read into our Constitution some sort of prohibition on arbitrary executive detention, but it's a very limited right. The other problem is extending that right outside of Australia, extraterritorially to Nauru and Manus Island has been difficult. In terms of breaching an international covenant, which we know we breach the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights all the time, it hasn't been implemented into domestic legislation. So what we do, we sign up to these instruments, and then we say, oh, but our common law covers all this in any case. We've got some statutes, I'm sure, somewhere that will cover that. So these rights are protected, but in fact, certainly Article 9 of the ICCPR, this is the main one prohibiting arbitrary detention, is breached all the time with our mandatory detention model. So there is no judicial remedy within Australia under the Constitution or under international law. The next best bet at the moment is using good old tort law, negligence, the breach of a duty of care that we have over people in detention. It's non-delegable, and we're finally seeing some interesting court cases in that area. People like George Newhouse are running those cases. So maybe we can have another session on that at some stage. Behind you, and then we'll to you. Yes, Sophie. Not yes. Your hand is up first. Okay.
Sort of building on that question, why doesn't the UN or some sort of international panel have any ability to actually charge or hold countries responsible for breaking the things that they've signed up to? And it seems that the only thing that they do is condemn their actions, but we're still able to go ahead and do these sort of foreign things to these.
Yes, unfortunately it's the nature of the international legal system that the only things that you find, the only times in which the international community can enforce the law will be in the International Court of Justice. No one's ever going to take Australia to the International Court of Justice for breaching the Refugee Convention or any of these covenants, because states just don't do that. And then with a negative decision from something like the Human Rights Committee that oversees the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it's just a view, it's seen as non-binding. So the international system works by, well, states are meant to respond to international embarrassment, basically. There seems to be no level of embarrassment that our country is going to respond to. And unfortunately, other states have seen that lesson as well. So, thank you for the question, Dave. Yes.
I think I'm correct in saying that the Greens Party is supportive of a different direction from the two major parties. Am I correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Because it does seem to me this has got to be a political solution ultimately. And we have in Canberra no no elected candidate for the seat of Canberra, but it's going to be competed between the Greens and the Labor Party. I wonder whether there's a way of using our political capacity in Canberra to force a real debate between the two candidates who are standing for to represent us.
Vote said last.
I think we'll just have well, we have two more questions and then we will call it a night. We do have refreshments in the foyer afterwards, so we have one more question.
Just very quickly, the gentleman who's asking about Manus in the High Court, you must read Julian Burnside's book, Watching Out. That has all the information in it.
And up at the back, the last question.
Thank you. Look, small acts are very meaningful. You know, when you're depressed, everyone will know if you're depressed, you go to the small things and you rescue, writing a letter, calling a friend. Not to undermine those small things. What are we going to do ahead of the next election, assuming it's early next year? That's big. I just want some hope around what that campaign might look like. I'm encouraged with the attacks on the ABC that we're seeing something that's really generating a positive conversation about the contribution of the national broadcaster. And I wonder if that's something in a collaborative effort with other RACs around Australia, where we interview the refugee, or we do something anyway to enliven that 25% or the 50% that want the people on that scenario back. I just think it's outrageous. We talk about the law, we have signed the international agreement on the rights of the child, and the situation on Nauru is just unbelievable. So yeah, just want to end with sort of hope around what the campaign may look like as we ramp it up, hopefully in the next few months.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's very important in the run-up to the next election, that we're going to have to find ways to make sure that this issue stays up front and that we challenge all the candidates about their position and do that nationally. We now have a national coordinating body of activist organisations here that we'll be proposing that we do that. Locally, I think it's an excellent idea to have a debate between candidates. We've actually done that in the past and got not very many acceptances, but with a new seat, perhaps that's a basis on which to do it. But as well, I think, we just want to try to make sure that the refugee issue isn't issue number 12 in people's voting intentions. We've got to push it up. And that's our role, I think, between now and May.
Can I just say, how do you do that when the media doesn't come to like the Palm Sunday afterwards? I mean, there was nothing on the news, on the TV, and the newspapers, anywhere about Palm Sunday. So how can you get it above 12 if the media, good media, ABC, there was nothing on the ABC, nothing at all.
It's very difficult to get media coverage as our media team here, who are working on it. We'll tell you, we keep plugging away at it, but we keep on trying to create events, that make it difficult for them not to cover. But also, we've also our social media team, if anyone would like to be involved in that, partly because the press has been so bad about covering the issue, we've found that we're going to have to rely on our own resources increasingly to get the word out, what we're saying, what we're proposing, what we're organising.
Okay, there was one, there's a very quick comment or question there.
important campaign at the moment. So if all these organisations get together, Get Up can sort of look at marginal seats, and we bring into marginal seats and try and change the vote.
Thank you for that final comment. We have to wrap it up here. I do have a few announcements before everyone disappears. First of all, if you're not already on the RAC mailing list, there's a table in the foyer where you can sign up. You'll also see some buckets on your way out of the doors for donations. As ever, there are costs associated with these events, from printing out brochures to flying in guest speakers. So if you're able to contribute, please do help out. I've already mentioned the next RAC event on the 27th of September, which is the official Canberra launch of Beirut's Chinese book. They've got a screenshot of behind me, and Beirut will be joining us by Skype from Manus Island, where he's been such an important voice. Talking about books, I'll just remind you again that Claire's book is available for sale. She will sign them, presumably, if you want. I'll certainly be buying one. Once you've purchased your book and made your donation, please join us for refreshments. But that just leaves me with asking you once again to thank the organisers and thank our excellent speakers.